Every superpower in history has followed the same predictable path to destruction. They rise through military might, dominate global trade, accumulate massive wealth, and then something changes. The debt starts growing faster than the economy. Interest payments consume more revenue each year. And suddenly, the most powerful nation on earth can't afford to defend itself anymore. Rome ruled the Mediterranean for centuries before debt destroyed it from within. Britain controlled a quarter of the planet until borrowing costs made the empire unsustainable. And right now, the United States is traveling down that exact same road, hitting the exact same warning markers that appeared before every previous collapse. As of January 2026, America's national debt stands at $38.43 trillion. That number is climbing by roughly $8 billion every single day. The country now spends more on interest payments than on national defense. And if you think this is just boring government accounting that doesn't affect your life, you're about to discover why this pattern has destroyed every dominant power that ignored it. The sequence always starts the same way. A rising nation needs military strength to secure territory, protect trade routes, and establish dominance. So it borrows money to build armies and fleets. This investment pays off spectacularly at first. Military victories bring new territories. New territories generate tax revenue. The borrowed money seems to pay for itself. Britain demonstrated this perfectly in the 1700s. At the time of the Glorious Revolution, British national debt barely existed. Then came 150 years of nearly constant warfare. Between 1692 and 1815, Britain was at war 62% of the time. The 7 Years' War alone nearly doubled the national debt from £75 million in 1756 to £133 million by 1763. But Britain was winning. They were building the largest empire in human history. Here's where the math turns deadly. Maintaining an empire costs more than conquering one. You need troops stationed across multiple continents. You need naval patrols protecting shipping lanes. You need colonial administrators, infrastructure, and the constant military presence required to suppress rebellions. These costs never decrease. They compound. By the time World War I arrived, Britain's debt had reached £650 million. 4 years later, it stood at £7.7 billion. The war transformed Britain from the world's largest creditor nation into a debtor owing billions to the United States. Interest payments alone consumed 44% of all government spending by the mid-1920s. That's not 44% of discretionary spending. That's 44% of everything. Think about what that means in practical terms. Nearly half of every tax dollar collected went to paying interest on past borrowing. Not building new infrastructure, not funding the military, just servicing old debt. The empire was trapped. They couldn't reduce military spending because threats from Germany and Japan were growing. They couldn't raise taxes because the economy was struggling. They couldn't default because that would destroy their credibility and access to future credit, so they kept borrowing. World War II pushed debt to 250% of GDP. Britain didn't finish repaying its World War II loans to the United States until 2006, 61 years of payments for a war that lasted 6 years. The pattern reveals itself clearly when you examine what happens to military capability during these debt spirals. Britain's defence budget was slashed 80% between 1919 and 1921. The empire that once dominated every ocean couldn't adequately defend itself against Germany without American help. By 1960, the British Empire had effectively ceased to exist, not because they lost a decisive military battle, because they couldn't afford to keep it. Rome experienced a nearly identical trajectory, just stretched across centuries instead of decades. The crisis of 33 AD provides a perfect case study. Emperor Tiberius decided to enforce an old law requiring creditors to invest a certain proportion of their capital in Italian land. Sounds reasonable, except all 600 senators were violating this law. When Tiberius gave them 18 months to comply, it triggered a cascade of financial destruction. Lenders started calling in loans early to raise the required capital. Borrowers were forced to sell real estate to repay those loans. Real estate prices crashed from the sudden oversupply. More loans defaulted. Banks across the empire started failing. Interest rates spiked. The Roman financial system nearly collapsed from a single policy enforcement. The emperor eventually fixed the immediate crisis by making 100 million sesterces available as interest-free loans to elites. But the underlying pattern continued. Over the following centuries, Rome progressively lowered interest rate caps from 8% to 4% to 0, desperately trying to make debt sustainable. When rate caps failed, they turned to currency debasement. Emperor Nero reduced precious metal content in coins while maintaining face value. By 300 AD, inflation had reached an estimated 15,000% over the previous century. The empire didn't fall because barbarians were stronger. It fell because Rome couldn't afford to pay the legions defending the borders. Soldiers went unpaid. Defenses weakened. The inevitable happened. Now, consider America's current trajectory. The national debt is 120% of GDP. Interest payments are projected to hit $1 trillion in 2026. The Congressional Budget Office forecasts that net interest will consume 13.85% of all federal spending this year, rising to 14.52% by 2028. And those projections assume interest rates don't spike unexpectedly. When Paul Volcker raised rates to crush inflation in the early 1980s, national debt was only 25% of GDP. The government had time to adjust. In 2026, debt has reached 120%. The impact of rate increases is now instantaneous. There's no adjustment period. Every percentage point increase in rates immediately adds billions to the deficit. You're watching the same pattern that destroyed Rome and Britain play out in real time. The question isn't whether this pattern leads to crisis. History has already answered that. The question is, what happens when the world's reserve currency issuer and largest military power enters the final stages of a debt spiral? The answer lies in understanding what makes America's position fundamentally different from every previous empire, and also what makes it exactly the same. Start with the difference. The United States controls the world's reserve currency. When Britain's debt became unsustainable, they owed money denominated in various currencies they couldn't simply create. When Rome debased its currency, the entire empire suffered immediate inflation, because Roman coins were the only medium of exchange within their borders. America can print dollars to service dollar-denominated debt. That sounds like an infinite money glitch. And in some ways, it is. Foreign governments need dollars to conduct international trade. Central banks hold dollars as reserves. Oil is priced in dollars. This creates constant global demand for the currency, regardless of how many dollars America prints. Spain's Philip II understood this dynamic centuries before modern economists gave it a name. Spain was drowning in debt from endless wars and religious crusades. The empire defaulted 4 times during Philip's reign. But here's what's fascinating. Credit always returned. The Genoese lent again. German bankers forgave. Why? Because being shut out of Spain's business was more expensive than accepting the risk of another default. Philip made himself too systemically important to abandon. Creditors were trapped in a relationship where walking away guaranteed losses while staying offered the possibility of eventual repayment. Modern economists call this the too big to fail dynamic. Spain pioneered it in the 1500s. America has perfected it. Foreign investors hold roughly 1/3 of total United States debt. Japan alone holds $1.2 trillion in treasury bonds. China holds over $800 billion. The United Kingdom holds hundreds of billions more. If these countries stopped buying American debt or attempted to sell their holdings rapidly, they'd trigger a global financial crisis that would destroy the value of their existing treasury portfolios. They're locked in. America's creditors cannot afford to stop lending without guaranteeing catastrophic losses on their current positions. This creates the exorbitant privilege. The United States can run deficits that would bankrupt any other nation because the alternative, a dollar collapse, is unthinkable to everyone holding dollar-denominated assets. But privilege isn't immunity. It's a delay mechanism. The same pattern that destroyed Rome and Britain still applies. It just takes longer to manifest and arrives differently. Here's where the historical parallel becomes unavoidable. Debt isn't static. It moves constantly, or it dies. Like a shark that suffocates if it stops swimming, debt must flow, roll over, and compound. The moment debt servicing stops, the moment liquidity dries up, the system suffocates. Every superpower eventually reaches the point where rolling over existing debt requires borrowing more than the economy can productively absorb. The debt compounds faster than economic growth. Interest payments consume an ever larger share of tax revenue. The gap between government spending and revenue widens. Then something breaks. Not suddenly, gradually, then all at once. For Rome, the break came through currency debasement and inflation. For Britain, it arrived through the loss of reserve currency status and the inability to finance defense. What's the breakpoint for America? Economists like former Fed Chair Janet Yellen have a name for what they fear is coming: fiscal dominance. This is the point where debt levels become so high that Federal Reserve policy gets hijacked by the need to keep the government solvent. When Paul Volcker raised interest rates to 20% to crush 1980s inflation, national debt was 25% of GDP. The government had breathing room. High rates hurt, but the economy could absorb the pain and adjust over time. At 120% debt to GDP, that breathing room no longer exists. Every percentage point increase in interest rates immediately adds tens of billions to annual deficits. The impact is instantaneous. There's no adjustment period because the debt is already so massive that rate changes hit the budget immediately. This creates a trap. If inflation rises, the Fed faces an impossible choice: raise rates to fight inflation and potentially bankrupt the government through exploding interest costs, or keep rates low, let inflation run, and watch the dollar's purchasing power erode. Both options destroy wealth, one through explicit default risk, the other through implicit default via inflation. When a reserve currency issuer reaches this point, creditors start questioning the entire framework. Right now, markets still believe America will keep rolling over its debt indefinitely. The magic holds because collective belief makes it so. We treat treasury bonds as sacred instruments backed by inertia and global necessity. But history shows these confidence frameworks are more fragile than they appear. A Greek crisis, a debt ceiling standoff, a credit downgrade. Any of these events can pull back the curtain and reveal that the powerful debtor is still just running the show through creditor paralysis, not actual solvency. Reinhardt and Rogoff documented this pattern across 8 centuries of financial crises. Countries that exceed 90% debt to GDP for extended periods experience significantly slower economic growth. America crossed 90% years ago and hasn't looked back. The research shows something else. Every generation of leaders convinces themselves their situation is unique. They believe this time is different. Better institutions, more sophisticated financial systems, smarter policymakers. Rome thought their engineering and military organization made them immune to fiscal collapse. Britain thought the pound's reserve status was permanent. Both were wrong. Debt spirals operate through mathematical inevitability, not historical contingency. Once debt grows faster than the economy's ability to service it, once interest payments consume productive capacity, once creditors start doubting repayment, the spiral accelerates regardless of institutional sophistication or military power. America isn't immune to mathematics. The only question is what the final stage looks like when the world's largest military power and reserve currency issuer enters terminal debt spiral. The path forward depends entirely on choices made in the next 5 to 10 years. History offers two templates. The first is managed decline. Britain provides the clearest example. After World War II, facing debt at 250% of GDP, Britain chose gradual adjustment. They maintained welfare commitments, slowly dismantled the empire, accepted diminished global influence, and took decades to pay off war debts. The final payment on World War II loans to America wasn't made until 2006. The pound lost reserve status. Living standards stagnated. But the system didn't collapse catastrophically. Britain remained a functioning democracy with intact institutions. They traded dominance for stability. The second template is chaotic rupture. Rome spiraled into currency collapse, with inflation reaching an estimated 15,000% between 200 and 300 AD. Political instability followed economic breakdown. The empire fragmented. What took centuries to build unraveled in decades. Citizens who stored wealth in Roman currency watched it become worthless. The infrastructure decay was so severe that European living standards didn't recover to Roman levels for over 1,000 years. Which path does America take? The decision isn't made in a single dramatic moment. It's being made right now through thousands of small choices. Every budget passed without addressing structural deficits. Every political campaign promising expanded benefits without explaining how to pay for them. Every central bank decision prioritizing short-term market stability over long-term fiscal discipline. The concerning pattern is that democracies historically struggle with these choices. Plato and Aristotle believed democracies were inherently fiscally irresponsible, because politicians could win elections by promising to give people benefits funded by borrowing from their own future. Pericles pioneered this approach in ancient Athens, creating massive entitlements that felt free in the moment but accumulated crushing obligations over time. Rome followed the same script. Free grain distributions, gladiatorial games, chariot races, all financed by debt and currency debasement. When economist Howard Kirshner studied these patterns, he concluded that when people give government the power to take from some and give to others, the process doesn't stop until the last bone of the last taxpayer is picked bare. America now faces the test every previous superpower failed. Can a democracy voluntarily impose discipline on itself during peacetime? Can politicians get elected by telling voters the difficult truth that benefits must be cut or taxes must rise? Historical precedent suggests the answer is no. Meaningful reform typically requires either extraordinary leadership during crisis or the shock of near collapse forcing change. There's one factor that makes America's situation different and more dangerous. Previous superpowers collapsed in isolation. When Rome fell, it didn't take down a globally integrated financial system. When Britain declined, the dollar replaced the pound in an orderly transition managed by an allied power. If America enters terminal debt spiral, there's no alternative reserve currency ready to absorb global trade flows. China's system isn't open enough. Europe is demographically declining. No regional currency has the depth or liquidity to replace the dollar. This creates what economists call systemic risk. America's creditors, particularly Japan and China, hold trillions in dollar-denominated assets. They can't dump those holdings without destroying their own balance sheets. They're trapped in a financial standoff where everyone knows the game is unsustainable, but no one can afford to stop playing. Philip II of Spain weaponized this dynamic in the 16th century. He defaulted repeatedly, yet creditors kept lending because being excluded from Spanish trade was worse than accepting partial repayment. Modern finance has amplified this trap through interconnectedness. When debt stops flowing, when confidence breaks, the system doesn't just slow down, it suffocates. Debt requires constant motion, like a shark requires water flowing through its gills. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how quickly paralysis spreads when trust evaporates. Now multiply that dynamic by the scale of sovereign debt. Over 50 countries are currently in debt crisis, according to development organizations. Rising interest rates to combat inflation have made existing obligations unpayable for developing nations that borrowed heavily when rates were near zero. The mix of public and private creditors, combined with opaque loan terms, makes restructuring nearly impossible. Each default increases pressure on the next most vulnerable debtor. America sits at the center of this web. If fiscal dominance forces the Federal Reserve to keep rates artificially low despite inflation, the dollar weakens and foreign creditors face losses. If rates rise to defend the currency, debt service costs explode and force impossible budget choices. There's no path that doesn't involve significant pain distributed somewhere in the system. The mathematics are unforgiving. Debt growing faster than the economy creates exponential divergence. Interest payments consuming increasing shares of revenue creates a negative feedback loop. Once started, these spirals are remarkably difficult to reverse without crisis-forcing change. America has entered that zone where small perturbations could trigger large dislocations, a recession that reduces tax revenue, a geopolitical shock that requires emergency spending, a credit downgrade that raises borrowing costs. Any of these could be the catalyst that breaks collective confidence. What separates this moment from previous warnings is the timeline. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments reaching $1.7 trillion annually within a decade. That's more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than Social Security. Just interest. At that point, the government is borrowing simply to service existing obligations. The shark stops swimming. The pattern is clear. The trajectory is set. The only variable is timing. And unlike previous superpowers that declined in isolation, this time the entire global financial architecture is built on the assumption of American solvency. When that assumption gets tested, we'll discover whether modern institutions can handle what historical precedent says is inevitable. The debt spiral doesn't announce itself with sirens and flashing lights. It arrives through accumulated choices, deferred decisions, and the seductive belief that this time will somehow be different. Every civilization that came before convinced itself it had evolved beyond the mistakes of its predecessors. Every empire believed its unique circumstances exempted it from mathematical reality. They were all wrong. America stands at the inflection point where managed adjustment remains possible but grows less likely with each passing budget cycle. The window for voluntary reform narrows as interest payments consume more revenue and political incentives favor short-term promises over long-term sustainability. History suggests democracies don't choose austerity during prosperity. They wait for crisis to force change. The pattern has played out identically across centuries and continents. Military expansion funded by borrowing. Initial success masking unsustainable costs. Interest payments crowding out productive investment. Creditor confidence eroding. Then rupture. Rome took centuries. Britain took decades. Modern financial interconnectedness means the next iteration could unfold in years. You're watching it happen in real time. The question isn't whether the mathematics work. The question is whether anyone will act on them before the system makes the choice for us. Every superpower eventually runs out of time. The clock is already running.